All right, cool. Um, but yeah, so the point is that like startups fail in all kinds of ways. There's personality conflicts, there's technology that changes, but a huge portion of this is a lack of really crystal clear communication, alignment, and understanding of the thing that you're building. And one of the reasons that happens is because if you're building something new and interesting, nobody else has built this before. So you have some image of it in your mind, and everybody who's working on it has an image of it in their mind, and they're often not the same, right? No matter how much time and effort you take to try and communicate clearly, new concepts are just difficult to visualize. They're often bigger and more unwieldy and complex, and the details matter. And so, in my experience, for games, for technology, most of these ideas fail because why is that? Here we go. They're too big. You have a team of folks who is, for instance, wants to make a game for the first time. They've worked at other companies, they decide they want to go out on their own. Um, you don't make a game because you have tiny dreams. You make a game because you want to make your dream game that is a culmination of all the things that you love and have experienced throughout the years. And the first time out, you want to land with a big impact, and so you decide, we're going to make our dream game, right? And of course, it's just enormous. Um, you know, that applies to all kinds of other things. It applies to consumer electronics. It applies to, tech of all kinds. Healthcare product that I worked on ended up scaling up into this huge, complex, unwieldy thing. Um, and so the biggest obstacle, right? I mean, that you can do something about. There's often like founder personality conflicts that are harder to deal with. But one of the really big things that you can do something about is to really just keep a lid on complexity. Um, and there, this is a tool for that. One of the most crystal clear examples of this process that I've worked on was for this game at a company where D and I worked together way back when. And I was brought onto one of the projects that they had going on. It was a revival of one of the company's classic IPs, and they wanted to bring it into the modern age. And the team had been working on this project for about a year. I think something on the order of 20 people on the project, and this had been the result of a year of collaborative work. And my question to you is, what is going on here? Like in this game, what are you doing? And this was a question that I asked the project lead a bunch of times because folks on the team kept asking me, right? Like I got put onto this project. They're like, "Oh, what are you going to do?" Like, I'm like, "I don't know. Like, what are we making?" And they're like, "I don't know," was the most common answer. And again, this is a year with 20 people, $1 million into the process at least. And the art is technically beautiful. I just don't know why it is what it is. And when I asked the project lead, his answer was, "This game is epic in scope. You can go anywhere, you can do anything." And to me, that sounds like a lot of tech people's pitch, right? Like, what's your product going to do? It's going to do everything. It's going to revolutionize all technology. Um, and the problem is, right? Like, if it is about anything, it's really about nothing. If it's for everybody, it's really for nobody. Um, but the biggest thing was that this lack of clarity as to what everybody was doing creates all kinds of problems, right? You have to keep going to the person in charge to ask them for clarity, right? And oftentimes, if it's something that is new and different, that person may not actually know, right? Their answer changes from query to query. And that means every time you ask them, you start working, and then that answer changes. Now, what happens to your work? So you keep having to validate, which means that you have a team of 20 people going to the project lead, asking them questions every day, having to get the same or slightly different answers every day. Um, if I'm an artist or a designer working on the project and I'm given uh, a task to create a system of some kind, how do I make a judgment about whether I'm successful or not? Unless I know how to measure good, right? Um, but that herky jerky lack of clarity also means that you end up throwing away a lot of work. And as anybody who has ever worked on anything knows, throwing away work is the same as misery. It's just being punched in the face over and over and feeling like you're wasting your time. Um, it also means that if you go out to external people and you can't explain what you're doing, you're not likely to get funding, right? And that applies to all kinds of startups looking for funding. You need to be able to clearly articulate what you're building and why. And all of this stuff, that lack of clarity, lack of autonomy, bottlenecks with, that impede your work, thrown away work are all corrosive to morale, right? You feel disempowered, directionless, and it just sucks. So one thing I learned at a giant company, Electronic Arts, in the probably 2004, was this process that EA had called the X, right? If you're working on a game project, you have to have an X, which is a one sentence statement that summarizes your whole game. And while I was an IC at EA and just trudging along on this team, I thought, boy, this feels like a really stupid exercise. We're making a game, it's complex, it's multifaceted, it will appeal to people in all kinds of different ways. Summarizing this in a sentence, how? Why? Right? Are the execs lazy? Are they stupid? Do they not care? Um, and it felt like just a useless garbage task that was a waste of time to appease a bunch of millionaires who would come in, sprinkle their whatever attention on our studio for 5 minutes, and that was all they could afford and all they could be bothered with. It felt disrespectful, and frustrating. And all of that was true. But I what I found when thinking about this other project was, hey, that's an interesting tool. You've been using it wrong. So what did we need to put this project in a different light? Well, we X'd it. We just said, what are we going to do to describe this product in one sentence? And it was clear that it couldn't be a sentence that was really a paragraph, an elevator pitch that really took a ride up to the top of the Empire State Building, right? Like just a sentence, a regular sentence that anyone can remember that is very, very specific, right? So go anywhere, do anything. It's short. It's not a run on, but it also doesn't really say anything. And so our process was basically I pitched to the leadership team, look, we're going to get everybody in the room who is a sort of key stakeholder, lead artist, project lead, lead producer. Um, it was going to be an expensive period of time, right? This isn't a like let's talk with some of the cheap folks, but on a per hour basis, it's like get everybody involved who costs a lot, which means it was a expensive proposition, because it also wasn't going to be a couple hours. This was going to take some time. And what we started with was just, process wise, a huge unfiltered word cloud of everything that seemed relevant. Right? This was a game that whose initial proposition was go anywhere, do anything. It was time to get more specific. And part of the idea was that in 2008, and sort of specific to 2008, for some reason, every game had bald space marines. It was all gray. Bump mapping was a new sort of thing. And so everything was bump mapped with gray, bald space marines fighting aliens. And the goal was how do we pull our game out of that, right? Like, how do we make it as different as possible? Who are we making this for? And if our sentence could describe our competitors, it needed to be more specific. And then, as before, short enough to remember easily. And so this became what I would think, I still think of it as about 5 days of 8 hour days locked in a room with something like 8 people arguing over every single word in a sentence. You're like, not just the words, the order of the words, the specific version of a word. Um, and it was like the most pedantic argument you could imagine. But at the same time, all of those words had meaning. All of them, you had arguments because people cared about that language, then they had different understandings of what these things meant. And often you'd spend 20 minutes arguing about, is it hyper, is it extreme, is it whatever, and then realize that no, you guys just agree, you're just thinking about the same thing using different words. But those arguments let you articulate all of your internal understanding of what you're trying to build and externalize it, right? Which is a thing that is super difficult to do when it only ever exists in your head. And it's even harder to do when the person who was the leader of the project has some very specific idea of what they want, but can't articulate it, right? So it, one of the things that I find that makes people resistant to this process is it feels dumb. It feels like a waste of time, right? Like, I'm not going to argue about the sentence. I know what it means, but you don't, right? And the problem is that you don't know that you don't know it until you run into all the problems that are fatal to startups and projects. So if you take the time to invest and say, look, how do you describe the thing that we're building in one sentence? And you say it has to be specific, it has to be short, it has to be memorable, and I care about every word that goes into this. You will find all your assumptions come out. You'll find every place where you're disjointed with every other person who is a stakeholder on the team and can influence these things. And you'll argue about it. But one of the great things about this is also it's a really wonderful exercise in communication. If you have startup co-founders and they can't agree on this sentence, hey, that's going to be fatal in the future. So it's actually a really neat way to test out how you communicate and make sure that you can have a contentious argument about something and focus on the meaning behind these things and not attack people personally and all that. But like that's a little bit of an aside. But the point is, you get to that short, sweet sentence. And so it took us a week of the sort of most powerful, influential people on the project um, arguing about individual words. And the end result was one sentence: a hyper agile gun and run with creative firepower, right? That sentence doesn't feel like it should have taken a week. But, but if you look at the concept art again, and I think it comes up again, I ask you, what's this game about? Right? Like, well, what's this game about? Because this is a game where there's movement, there's something visual and interesting. Hyper agile means something specific. Um, it let us define the character instead of being an arbitrary alien in armor or a guy in alien armor. Now they have armor that is specifically focused on hyper agile. A really common phrase you hear to describe a whole genre of games is run and gun, right? You run, you gun. And I found the inversion really awkward. I hated this phrase. Like, just, oh, it sounds so bad. Like, it sounds so awkward. But the reason it won in the end was that the guns were more important than the runs. Ooh, that's terrible too. Sorry. you know, it was the right priority. And in the end, the right priority matters more than whether I think running gun sounds better than gunning, right? Creative firepower was a big deal. We wanted our weaponry to feel like something different. And so that informed a whole structure and system about how you acquire this weaponry, how it behaves, and it turned into this whole combinatorial thing, which was really cool. And you could make all kinds of different weapons out of it, which is why we have this little electric arc thing, and then we have this bouncy shot and all kinds of stuff. But one of the things that was really amazing about this is that you had a team working on this project for a year, and they were the resulting artwork communicated almost nothing. This is, I think, 4 days later, right? And everybody's on the same page. If I recall correctly, the two pieces of art on the top are one artist and the one on the bottom is a different artist. But if you put them all together, immediately they all work, right? That same kind of color, saturation, movement. And it's because everybody understood the assignment. And one of the things that I think was the most amazing about this, well, give me a sec. So there are obviously benefits, right? Elevator pitch, super easy to understand. That's why most people do this, right? The X was essentially an elevator pitch to get your game validated by an exec who didn't give a shit and could only spend 5 minutes with you. But I think the most important thing is being able to clearly articulate your vision to your team and to get everybody on board to understand why you're building the thing that you're building, right? That's the real bit. It also means that all of your people are on the same page and everybody becomes engaged with it, what that vision is. A hyper agile gun and run with creative firepower. The moment we put out that sentence, right? And it was like this weird reveal, right? Like you're like, hey, we got everybody together. What have we been working on for 5 days arguing? You can hear us in the conference room. Hyper agile, gun and run with creative firepower. Ta-da! And everybody's like, okay, that's 5 days of work. And then one of the engineers raised their hand and they're like, I've been working on a cover system, right? And in 2008, there was a game called Gears of War that had a system where you could sort of hide behind stuff and shoot over it. That was the defining feature of that game, and it was inherited from another game, but it became the thing. Every game had to have a cover system. So this engineer is working on a cover system, and he raises his hand and goes, "This doesn't feel hyper agile. Should I keep working on it?" Well, no. Next question. Let's go. And immediately those things started coming from everywhere, right? Like I'm currently working on this thing. Does it fit? Well, hyper agile, gun before run, creative firepower. No, stop working on it. Or let's get you together with a little sub team and figure out how to take that thing and turn it into something that is aligned with that vision. But the thing that it did was everybody understood what they were doing. Now everybody's engaged, right? Instead of having the one guy at the top who you have to ask for direction. Oh, that's funny. Um, instead of the one guy at the top who you have to ask for direction, where you take your brain and put it aside and ask them what they want, you're engaged. Your decisions matter. Your judgment matters, right? And you know that you can make decisions that are aligned with the vision of the whole team. Again, this is the thing that I feel like should be straightforward. And for whatever reason in practice, never is. Nobody does it. And part of the issue, I think, is that when you are trying to think of something new and something creative and something interesting that hasn't been made before, it is very easy to answer questions and not know what your answer really is. Right? I think of this as hand wavy bullshit. Right? Oh, we're supposed to do this because blah 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 blah. And then you ask someone else, and they're like, and somebody else asks you, and you're like, oh, we're supposed to do this because blah blah blah. And what I'm distracting you from is the fact that I actually don't have an answer, but I need to tell you something. So watch me sing and dance, and hopefully you'll pay attention to this and not ask me the deeper question of why am I actually doing this. But if you go through and you have a sentence, and I say it's a hyper agile gun and run with creative firepower, I can't bullshit you anymore. This is the thing that we're building, right? If my answers don't align with that sentence, my answers are wrong. And everybody can call me out on it. So, you know, that's a really interesting side effect of forcing you to explain this thing. So previously we had bottlenecks, we had no autonomy, we had throwaway work. And by coming to some sort of creative statement that clarifies all of that, everybody's aligned. People correct their own work. Your message and your thinking are clear. That's good for your brain. And everyone's on board, right? Like you can have people argue about it and you can listen to those arguments. You can take in that feedback. You can change your sentence if you need to. to get everybody on board. But once everybody's on board, you are all in this together and you are all working towards that same goal. And if somebody goes off and they're like, "No, man, running gun, running is important." No, it's not. It's this way, right? And you've put that stake in the sand, stake in the planted a flag in the ground, I don't know, stake in the sand, whatever, and said, "This is what our values are, and this is how we make decisions." So this stuff doesn't work anymore. You actually have to all be working towards the same goal. So another just example. In 2018, I worked on a VR app for post-stroke rehab. So if you have a stroke, you have a blood clot in your brain, it kills part of your brain, causes often a bunch of negative effects, as you would imagine, from brain damage. It can cause a lack of ability to control parts of your body. It can cause personality issues, all kind of perception issues, all kinds of stuff. But this was an app specifically focused on physical rehab for people who had physical issues related to strokes, right? So the thing that is interesting about that is the cure or the best treatment for that kind of stroke is PT, physical therapy. You go to rehab, you do a bunch of exercise, and through massive brute force repetition, you reconnect a new part of your brain to your body, right? It seems like, how is that possible? But it is, it works. It's scientifically proven. The more you do, the better you get. Does You won't always recover everything, but with sufficient repetition, most of these things are rewirable, which is awesome. And so the idea was VR can enable a bunch of things that have not been possible before. And so I was hired onto this project in, I think, 20 late ended 2017, beginning of 2018, and a team had put together a prototype. And I'm going to be a little disparaging about this team because they deserved it. This is one of the most arrogant teams I had ever worked with. They were stupendously obnoxious, incredibly condescending, wouldn't listen to anybody, right? So uh that is what it is. I don't mean to be a jerk, but it resulted in some stuff. They sort of unilaterally declared that they wanted things to be classy, familiar, easy to render in VR. That's not in itself bad, right? All those things are good by many metrics. The arrogance comes from the fact that they didn't talk to any users. They didn't talk to any stroke patients. They didn't talk to any therapists. They looked at what was out there, assumed they could synthesize the best of what was out there, and then they decided to make this thing. And their idea was it's going to be like We Fit, which is the top image, plus these VR kind of apartment therapy sort of things, because that's aspirational and cool. The avatar is a young, fit lady, and in some contexts, maybe those things are all good, right? But good's a lot of things. And if all you judge is good, it will lead you in every direction. Right? If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know why you're doing, all of these things can be good, and doing them all will destroy your team, destroy your product, ruin your life. In order to distinguish between things that are good, you have to know what you're doing. You can see how this is just going to lead back to the same thing, right? Like, so this is not the actual prototype, but it's sort of what the image looked like. Um, and we went and talked to therapists and patients, and we learned as deeply about strokes as we could. We learned about state of the art treatments. We learned about actual human patient experiences. And a couple of things we found were the 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 main customer of a post-stroke physical rehab system is a 65-year-old woman, right? Probably because women tend to survive longer. That seems to be the gender imbalance thing. But this was not the right avatar for them. Aspirational, minimalist Scandinavian apartment was not the right environment for them. Um, every healthcare VR tech app under the sun went for this same aesthetic, the minimalist, clean, blah blah blah. And the last part was, if you look at what physical therapists are capable of doing today in their therapy environment, this doesn't do anything that a therapist can't do already with blocks and motivational speeches and the actual environment that they will be doing therapy in. And so, we sat down and we did sort of the same thing with the sentence, except at this point we were a little more experienced, so we just jumped in and did a bunch of research. And we did that same kind of word cloud, refinement. What kinds of things are important to us? What kinds of things are important to the therapist? What kinds of things are important to the patients? Rank them all, beat our heads against each other for, a week or two. And we came to a very imperfect version of it. But over time, as we told this story again and again, we refined it until it became something very similar to this, which is rehabilitation through emotionally engaging, empowering play. And, those things all came from research, right? One of the reasons that people quit therapy, you go to have a stroke, you become partially paralyzed. One of the worst experiences you can have. The thing you have to do is go to physical therapy. Insurance in the US covers it for a month, insurance in Europe covered it for a year. It seems like that disparity is terrible, but none of it matters because everybody quit after a week, right? Because therapy sucks. It's boring, it's painful, it's frustrating. Um, most PT activities are things like pick up this can and move it. Put it in from this circle on a table to this other circle on a table. And you're taking somebody who is 65, they've lived a pretty good life up to that point, and saying, hey, that thing that you could do yesterday without even thinking about it, try doing it. Can't do it. That sucks. Right? Because you're disabled. Hey, you're disabled. Right? That's like all the therapy did was just yell at them. You're disabled. Your life is terrible. Um, and no wonder you'd be discouraged and quit. Right? So empowering, right? Struggling to do these simple things is incredibly depressing. The other thing that we realized was that if you're 65-ish, you've tended to be someone who has been part of the community, who has helped people, who is used to being empowered. You're providing services for others. That's often a way that it's very deeply integrated into your identity at that point, right? Asking for help is not where you are. That's not what you want to do. Feeling like you're disabled and you need people's help feels real bad. And then the last thing is play. And the thing that we came to realize after quite a lot of bashing our heads against stuff is that while play is a really mm, it's a word that everybody wants to harness, right? People are like, oh, video games, like games are so engaging, how do we harness that? But uh healthcare companies suddenly get really embarrassed when you say play, as though you're not serious. Well, we are very serious. Very serious. I care a lot about helping these people because my dad was paralyzed in a car accident and it's super fucking personal to me. And everybody on this team had some personal connection to someone who had had a stroke, someone who had been through massive therapy and needed, this to work. And the thing that we realized, again, through extensive conversations with therapists and patients, play. Think about like two lion cubs like wrestling with each other and chomping each other on the face and neck and biting and thrashing about, right? Like play is low stakes experimentation simulating real world things that teach you how to do stuff, right? You get to bite your sibling on the back and they're not going to murder you, right? Like that's play. And that's how you learn everything, right? Despite our current educational system, right? Like like um but that was what we realized was, when did you learn to use your body? You learn to use it as a baby, running around doing things, picking up stuff, shoving them in your mouth. Like that's play. And what we need is play that is appropriate for a 65-year-old who has gone through the worst experience that they're likely to have. And so the thing that we made looks nothing like a Scandinavian apartment building with an abstract, young lady doing stuff. We created a environment of these little cartoon penguins who were trying to farm in this valley to survive. And what you do as a stroke patient, we took completely recognizable physical therapy exercises, such as raising your arms, and turn them into things you do, right? So you will often take your paralyzed arm and you'll attach it to your good arm via some stick or like thing with a strap, and you just raise both arms up symmetrically, right? And I can do that because I am not paralyzed. But if you are, you do this and then you assist your other arm, and sometimes you can get some motion out of it. And this son had this huge cartoon, Tex Avery kind of face on it because that's something that people of 65-year-old will recall as a kid, as a younger person. And it animates like crazy. It has actually a really long nose. And so as it tilts from side to side, you see it. It's very emphasized. And as it tips, because you're not raising your hand symmetrically, whoa, and it's cartoony and over exaggerated because people have perception issues when they have strokes. It is animated and always happy, right? Like it may be tipped and kind of like yee, but it's like wee, right? Like, and it gets happier and happier the higher it gets and the more symmetric it is. And if you nail it, the penguins celebrate and it celebrates and they're grateful because you help them, grow a big watermelon, right? And this is looks absolutely nothing like the prototypes did. And when we showed it to doctors, they were surprised. But all of our games were like this. They were recognizable therapy exercises. So as soon as the doctors tried it, they're like, "Oh, I understand it. This is familiar." They would all be things that were recontextualized in some way. It wasn't here's a thing that you used to do and you can't now. It was here's a thing you've never done. And so if you can't, it's okay. Try something, experiment, do it over and over again. The other thing we had was, instead of picking up a can and putting it somewhere else, we had a Disney princess experience where there were a bunch of little stumps and birds would fly down onto the stumps and you would pick up a bird and it would sit on your finger and sing to you and animate and be like very happy, and you would lift it up and put it in its nest. And as you put more into their nest, you'd have this chorus of happy birds that loved you and were very grateful that you helped them. And we showed this to some very German doctors. They were like, yeah, he had to see us. They were very, if you think like BMW engineers, but doctors and maybe angry, like they were here being sold the company's other products, and so they were used to being pitched, and they expected us to do the sales pitch for this thing that was not going to be all that impressive. They put it on, and we're just like, what is happening? And the interesting thing is they just kept doing it. They didn't want to stop. They recognized that the things that they were doing were physically relevant, but they would laugh at the birds and like again, super serious, sort of dour German doctors giggling as they're like moving these birds around. You're like, that's it. That's the thing you need for your patients. And they'd be like, yeah, you know. Um and they'd be sold, right? Totally unexpected. The moment they used it, it was obvious that it was what they wanted, right? Because they knew the therapeutic side of it. You didn't have to explain it to them. And then they knew the other magic was going to be that we can lie to you in VR about what your body's actually doing, which was a whole bunch of interesting things that could go into to research about feeding back good information, right? Because if you're saying, hey, raise your arm and your arm doesn't move anywhere, you're not building up a good feedback cycle. But if we raise your arm and we raise your arm for you, you're at least giving good feedback into the brain signal that you're using. So again, weird product, but it came from focus. It came from understanding what was important to us. It came from understanding what was important to the doctors, and the whole team knew what to do. Right. So we took this thing that nobody really had built before. It didn't look like anything else. And this is the product of, I think, 2 days of prototyping plus a month and a half of refinement. Right. We used it with real patients after that 2 days of prototyping. So they saw it immediately, and we didn't do anything to polish this thing up and make it look good until we knew it worked. which is great. So, one sentence, right? Like, I feel like I'm not trying to oversell this, but I know it sounds kind of ridiculous. Um, one of the things is that it's very easy to not do like to do this, but not do it right, right? And the biggest thing is if I can describe a product with this sentence, that's fine. That's something better, but it has to be able to describe just your product, right? If this can describe your biggest competitor, you are not differentiating it well enough. And so it's got to be specific, like really, really specific for your audience, for your product, for the priority, the hierarchy of priorities you have. And then in an ideal world, it's the super elevator pitch. You can tell this to someone once and they'll remember it. They may not recite it exactly, but they should get close. They'll get the big meaning. And then again, because this is primarily an internal facing tool, if your team hears this, they should be able to recite it exactly. Right? For your team, it's not about the gist of it. It is about every fucking word being exact. And it should be easy, right? I can't say for sure, but I have a pretty strong suspicion that if you took everyone who was in that room for the game pitch and you said, "What is Turrican? What is Cyclone? The project name? What is the sentence?" They'd get close. We wrote that sentence 17 years ago. I know everybody knows its impact. So memorable, simple, dense with meaning, but not ridiculous. And then again, expect it to take days. Expect it to blah, 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 invest all the people that really matter to this process, who have influence and are responsible for decision making and setting the direction of things. If you're working for a company, this is going to be a hard argument to make because it's very expensive. If you're working on a small team, do it because it's worth it. um, honestly, this will turn around whatever time you put into it and be worthwhile. Because if you think about the cost of prototyping, you think about the cost of testing your things, right? You will normally sit down and code something and then you'll be shocked when it doesn't work or when that prototype is not what you thought it was. There is no faster way to be on the same page than to just get the words right. Right? This is like a no cost. Well, I mean, it's expensive in time, but you're not spending any time prototyping things. You're not roping engineers in who don't need to be there. You're not, spending thousands on focus groups. This is just internal communication. It's very cheap. It iterates incredibly fast. I don't think there is a more efficient tool. It just feels weird when you do it because you're like, oh yeah, we invested $10,000 of time in this 5 word sentence. And you're like, yeah, yeah, but that saved us like 6 months, a year, right? Like that project that had been running was running for a year with 20 people and they got nowhere. So the relative cost is tragic in that case, but like, you can say it is going to be worth it. I, I've never seen a situation where it's not worth it. And then, the last thing is the sentence can evolve periodically, right? But think of this as the nucleus of your project, of your startup. It's not a moving target, right? It's a moving target when you get significant new knowledge, right? You test a concept, you find out some assumption you made was incorrect. But this should be stable. This should be a kind of thing where you come back to once a year, maybe. Because if you're learning stuff faster, your your core assumption needs to be based in something. And that belief, that value that you've based it on shouldn't be ever changing. Because again, it's a direction, it's like a North Star for your team, right? If that North Star is constantly moving, it loses its value. So consider this an investment. You spend the days doing it, you get that sentence right, you work toward that destination. And then as you learn things that change the destination, you can change, but don't change it super often. Is, I think, just the basic advice. So, okay, you made a sentence. Cool. Uh, this is what it's for, right? You're empowering people. You're moving fast. You're testing ideas early. You got a clear pitch. I think a lot of teams are sort of operate like this traditionally. Some person has a plan, George, and then you have people who are on the ground. They're looking at all the stuff. They're coding. They're interfacing with customers. They're doing all kinds of stuff. Uh, and then there's lack of communication, right? If you don't recognize this, you haven't worked on a lot of teams. um, I think, and this is I think my own perspective. I don't know that you'll share it, but this is my view. Um, my view is I want my life to be as easy as possible. I want the most number of people involved in heading to the right destination. So if everybody understands what you're doing, you can now distribute authority. You can teach people to make the same decisions as you, the way you would have made them, you using the information that you would have used to make these decisions, but better because I'm not coding anything, right? So I'm not making engineering decisions. If some engineer comes to me and says, "Hey, should I do A or B?" I don't know, right? I know where the North Star is. You know where the North Star is relative to the specifics of A and B. You can make a better decision about this than I can. But traditionally, you've come to me for a decision for tradition reasons. Not because I'm the best at knowing, it's because I'm the guy in charge and you do that. But let's not do that. Let's teach you how to make decisions the way I make them, right? And it is not enough to have this one sentence. I wish it was, but it's not. So it's not job done. We came up with a sentence. Everybody understands. You will see immediate alignment and direction change, but it'll also go cattywampus, right? So the positives are there, but it's not enough. And what will happen is at first, people will come to you and ask you to make decisions. And it'll feel great, like, oh, I know what we're doing. We clarified all this through this sentence. We all have this great direction. This feels great. I can make a clear decision. Everybody understands it. Go, go, go. Right? Like, again, as somebody in that position, whoo, no better feeling. Right? I feel useful. I feel knowledgeable. I feel like my vision is valued. But as this evolves, what I would recommend is talk through these things with people as though you were thinking about it through it, right? Like, hey, what would I do? Right? You know the sentence, you know what you're doing. Ideally, you know something about what the team values, speed, robustness, whatever it is. How would you make this decision? And then, like, literally, that's the conversation that I would have with people. What do you think I'd do? Here are all the tools. And we'd go through that. And then even later, you get to not make any decisions because everybody starts doing what you do. And your job is to make sure that that North Star is actually in the right place, that everybody knows that it's there, that you establish the values of your team and company, that you're working with all the outside stakeholders to make sure that's all the right thing to be doing. And if that's all good, everybody else does everything else. That feels so much better than being the nexus of knowledge. But man, being the nexus of knowledge feels great. It feels vital and important and hard to give away. But if you give it away, your life will just get easier and easier. And more than that, you'll be delighted by all the shit that people do that is perfectly aligned with what you want that you didn't even know existed. Right? Because you are empowering people with all kinds of disparate knowledge to attack the same problem in ways you couldn't have imagined. It is awesome. Right? So that sentence, that clarity is how you turn everybody into leaders of their own domain, right? They all have specialized skills, they all have specialized talents, things you don't have. You will still be leading in sort of in some capacity, right? Because there's still going to be things that you are going to do that other people won't. But if you have everybody's eyes on the prize and they're all working toward that same destination, you'll win. I'm a big car guy, uh, And so I often think about these things in metaphors that, well, also a mechanical engineer. So all this works its way back to this. One of my favorite racing teams was Lotus, and their whole vibe was simplicity and lightness. This is not a quote from Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus, but it was apparently his favorite quote. I don't recall where it came from, and I should look it up and credit it appropriately. But I like it because simplicate is such a weird word, and you don't add lightness, so it's just a really awkward phrase, which makes it memorable. But the idea is, you can have the most complex, most powerful, most expensive thing, and if you have massive amounts of horsepower, you can accelerate really fast. You go straight really quickly. But if you have a light car that can turn fast, that can accelerate well, lightness affects everything. Power only affects acceleration, and weight makes it harder to slow down, it makes it harder to turn. Taking up 5 pounds out of your car is significantly more useful than adding more horsepower. And if you look at this Bugatti, it was built to be the fastest car in the world. And it was. It's not anymore. But costing this exorbitant amount of money, had all this technology to give it as much power as possible, and it was very heavy and very complicated. This other car is built in England by a bunch of dudes in a shed, right? Like, and if you put it around Top Gear's test track, which was sort of at the time a fun way to compare a whole bunch of different cars, the Veyron fast as hell, right? That is a spectacular time. This thing beat it by a lot. Like 3 seconds in a 1 minute, 1.25 minute lap is insane. And it turns better, it's faster, it stops faster, it does everything better because it's lighter. And I think that this concept of inertialess development, right, is really uh I don't know, it's really useful. Um, your goal, if you consider your goal to simplicate and add lightness, right? Your goal is to be able to change direction instantly. And if you think about working at a big company, it's exactly the opposite of that, right? You make 6 month projections about what you think you're going to do, and then you build up systems and you hire whole teams of people to do those things. And then you run some experiment and oh shit, you got it all wrong. Well, we got to go change the estimates. We got to realign the executives. We got to like fire half of that team. We got to change all this other stuff. That's all inertia, right? And it damages morale because you're sinking a lot of cost throwing away work. Sometimes you don't change because there's too much sunk cost, which just means now you're just heading in the wrong direction. And it's weird, but expectations, just making a prediction about the future, creates all this inertia, right? And so I think that, one of the things that's nice about this sentence is it gives you focus, right? It makes your product smaller, it makes it more contained. And that means if you need to test a thing, you know a little bit more about it, right? Um, I'm sure a bunch of you have heard about MVP, right? I don't know whether you have positive or negative feelings about it. Maybe thumbs up for positives, thumbs down for negatives. Okay, a little mid, a little up. Okay. I'm a big thumbs up. And one of the things that I find that leads people, and you can correct me if your experience is different here, but one of the things that I find that is often a failure, a way that people have a bad experience with MVP. Interesting. I want to know about that. But one of the ways that people have a bad experience with MVP is actually it's not M enough. They build too much, and then they build things. They build too much, so it's not good. And you go out and you test this like mostly viable product, and people have a bad experience with it, and then of course you don't get the results you want, and then people are frustrated, and right. But minimum, if you strip everything down to minimum, right, and you have that one sentence that is like, I know exactly what my game is, I know exactly what my product is, and you need to test something, you build only the thing that tests that one thing. And I don't know how to, I don't, the problem is this is a really hard process. So I don't know how to convince you in 5 minutes that minimum is really, um, but in my experience, if you are not ashamed of the thing that you're showing, it's not minimum enough. You spent too much time. Think of this as the inertialess development, right? You're building as little as you can, you're coding as little as you can. Hopefully you're not coding anything. Um, Going out there with led by that sentence and then saying every time you release something to anybody, it's a question, it's an experiment, it's a way to ask somebody, ask the world, right? Does this thing do what I want it to? And the way to iterate quickly and learn as fast as possible is to say this release is a test, it is going to do X, and X is a really specific thing. X is I'm going to release a thing and I expect it to increase day one retention by 5%, right? It is not I'm going to release this thing and I expect day one retention to be better. I know that seems, again, pedantic, but it's this. Better is bullshit. Because what will happen is you'll run that test, it'll come back at 3%, and it'll be like, yeah, it's better. Ha! Right? But it's not 5%. When you say 5%, I'm asking you what you think this experiment is going to do and what you believe the answer is going to be. And I want you to look at the audience, understand this feature and how they're going to respond to it, and then predict the result. And if you can do that correctly and you really understand your audience, then you've given me a number that you either beat or you don't. And if you don't, that experiment failed, right? And what usually happens is hand wavy bullshit. It's better. I don't care that it's better. I care that you understand your audience and you understand what you're building, right? So you build the smallest thing you need to do to answer that question in enough detail that you can walk away with a legit answer. You do it in a way that is cheap and quick because, again, when you get that answer, it'll probably lead you in a different direction. And then you need to call all of your shots because this whole thing is about understanding your product and understanding your audience. And, again, the reason that this ties into that sentence is that sentence prevents bullshit. It prevents you from being able to say this is a thing that you intended to do when you really didn't. And it forces you to structure your tests around the thing that you're building and knowing what that is. And I know this sounds crazy. Most people putting out builds, putting out tests don't know why they're doing it. They're just trying to get more information, which is good. More information is good, but it's not as good as knowing what you're asking. And maybe we talk about this some other time. But MVP, all the variations of MVP that are not laser focused on minimum are bullshit. I will die on that hill. Like the idea of a minimum lovable product is such laughable garbage that it just makes me incredibly angry, and totally defeats the purpose. Minimum is about scaling it all back to only answering that question. And the reason that it's so hard and the reason that people default to this other stuff is that they don't know what the question is because they don't know what they're building. You will, if you do this, you'll have a better idea. You will use that as a guide to make this as small as you can. And when you do, and you call your shots and you say what the hypotheses are, you build the smallest amount. That cycle of build, measure, learn gets really fast. And if you get that faster than your opposition, you win at literally everything. It doesn't guarantee success, but it means that you will find the best possible outcome as fast as you can. And that is definitely true about testing things with honest people. All right. Let's see. So startups, projects, they fail in a bunch of different ways. I hope that if you can really look at a concise, focused, one sentence description of what you're doing, you'll see how a lot of this stuff gets fixed. Founder conflict gets resolved because you're really talking about the same thing. You're not assuming what you're talking about. You actually are very explicit about it. Market shifts, you may still miss stuff, but you'll know you missed it. Like you actually know what you're shooting for. Most of these new projects really don't often define even what their target is. Complexity and delays, well, we're making things small. Technology shifts pretty much like market shifts. But technology shifts and being beat to market are really just about being fast, learning fast. And that comes from focus. Small, everything small. Bad go to market strategy comes because you don't understand your market. You don't understand your audience. With this, hopefully you will. And then vision unclear is the thing that really gets fixed by it because you have argued your vision to death. Well, hopefully to life. You've argued your vision to life and come to some concise version of what it should be. So, yeah, that was an hour to tell you to write a sentence about the thing that you're doing. Um, and the reason that I wanted to be this explicit about it is every time I have seen someone say, yeah, 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 that sounds like a good idea. And then they don't do it. They fall into all of these pitfalls. Every project falls into all these pitfalls. This is just a tool that helps you get out of them, to avoid some of them, to have good answers when you do. So yeah, if you do decide to do this and you invest the time to beat your head against something and you come up with a sentence, please bounce them off me. I would love to hear them. I I love nothing more than hearing, articulated pitches for weird things. And usually what the first level of feedback is going to be, oh yeah, that I still don't understand what you're doing. But that's good, right? Like you'll get there, and it takes iteration. And I've done this enough that I sort of have, I think, a pretty good feel for what the level of specificity should be. Um, so if you are willing to share, I'd love to be a resource for you, just because I enjoy it. If you're a huge company and you want help doing something like this, and you guys have a bunch of money, then I will ask you to pay me. If you're not, I don't care, and I'm happy to help. Uh, so yeah, that's it. If anybody's got questions or comments, feedback, I would love feedback. If you want to send me feedback offline, that would be very appreciated. I know I can be a bit rambly. So thanks for your patience. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, firstly, good meeting you in virtual person. Secondly, yeah, there's some really good nuggets there that resonate with me because the years I worked at BioWare, and not just BioWare, other companies as well, is sort of, and I think you can probably understand this. You start with this vision, right?
Mhm.
And it's pretty focused. And then scope creep, right? The designers say, yeah, yeah, man, what if we could ride horses? What if
Oh
we
yeah.
could swim? What if we could climb walls, right? So, you start having people talking about it publicly and all of a sudden, it gets out there and goes, oh, hey, this new game, this new RPG, you're going to be able to like grow a beard.
You
It's
can
so
go anywhere. You can do anything.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that as the deadline approaches,
Hmm.
the knives come out.
Hmm.
So they just start, hacking everything down. And I've always tried to, I mean, I've never been in a position, except for now that I have my own dev studio, to sort of really emphasize the idea of let's start something that is good at its core, and then we can add the bells and the whistles and the icing and everything.
Yeah.
But it's just not, people start adding, one incident where we were trying to figure out our gameplay loop, and for this one game at a company I was working at, and they had vehicles in before, but they were super buggy, and they weren't even on the list. We had a team meeting similar to what you talked about, where we just sat down for days and just what is our gameplay loop,
Hmm.
and then the CEO, who happened to be also at that point in time the lead programmer slash designer, came
Oh
in on a
no.
Monday morning and said, "I got vehicles working," and
Yep.
we're like, That's not on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
It's not. What are you
Yeah.
doing?
And yeah, and I mean like I think I I don't think I've been on a game that hasn't had that happen, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
and I think that the challenge is, that scope creep needing to get cut later is super hard, right? Because often these things intermingle with other systems and it's never clean to cut something out. So those knives have to come out early, right? Like the idea would be that you would never be in that situation because your lead designer, programmer, CEO would have been forced to articulate what this game is about. And if they started working on vehicles before they were 90% complete, somebody would be like, "What the hell are you doing, man?"
yeah, yeah.
Right? And you had mentioned on LinkedIn, that you're like, "Hey, we have this big huge idea. Is it worth making something smaller?" And I would say make your big huge idea smaller, right? They're not different, but there's something about that big huge idea that is new, right? I
Hmm.
hope. I like it. I think making games is so damn hard that it would be really silly to go out and make something, that someone else has made. So
Yeah.
something in there is really new. You're building this big huge concept around some nugget that you really care about. What is that? And what is the smallest version of it that communicates that idea? Right? It may not be small, because your concept may inherently be about exploration and growth or something. But what's the smallest version of it? How do you test whether you can test whether growth and exploration are interesting without making it big,
Mm.
right? But you have to think about what is the emotional sort of resonant thing about exploration and what's the smallest.
Yeah. That's really the challenge because, it does the scope of what we want to do feels really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And, we're even though all of us have experience, we haven't worked together as a team.
Mhm.
So it's like,
So
well, okay,
this is a great experiment then. Because if you haven't worked together as a team, this is a really intense communication situation. It'll force you to articulate your assumptions, which means that you haven't worked together, so you all are coming from slightly different directions and heading in slightly different directions based on this thing that you're talking about. So getting everybody into alignment uh, early is team building, right? You're learning about your teammates, you're learning about how they communicate, you're learning about what they value, and you're making sure everybody's doing it together.
yeah, yeah, we've already had some, we're all pretty good. We're professional, we're civil, we're friends, but we have had definitely those like head-on collisions where I didn't think that.
Yeah.
Where did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah.
So, no, you make a really good point. That's something I'm really going to pitch to the team.
Awesome. And if you need help like with it, like please reach out. I'm happy to help just you figure it out. I'm happy to help your team try it.
Will do.
Yeah, but okay. Victoria. I mean, I point like this because you're over here on my screen. I don't know where you are,
On the
so
side, yeah. Um, First, awesome presentation. I was
okay.
super cool I love the specifics too of hearing the stories. I felt like that really helped like communicate like exactly what you meant by like creating the sentence. I had two questions based on what you presented. So one was in both of your anecdotes, it sounded like they didn't create the sentence soon enough. It was like already kind of late.
Mhm.
So when is the time? Like when would ideally be the time you create the sentence?
Yeah.
And then my second question is actually kind of related to that. So I'll say both.
Yep.
Which is what if you're solo? Since I'm working solo and this feels like a really useful exercise, especially given how many people I like talk to about like what I'm working on. But you mentioned, and I think in the slides, like, don't do this by yourself. So I'm curious, um, yeah, I guess both when in the
Cool.
process and what do you do when you're solo?
Yeah. Great questions. When in the process is a tricky one. I think, the blanket answer is as early as possible, but that doesn't really tell you anything, right? I found for me the healthcare thing came together uh, after we had done a bunch of research, right? Because we started to hear the same concepts come up over and over again. And so we kept an ear out for things that we knew would be important that would also resonate with people when we reflected them back at them. Right. So that was part of it. It wasn't something that we came out of the gate before talking to anybody about. What we did do for the healthcare thing was we went to the therapists and patients with a clearly articulated, intentional approach of what is it that works for therapists, what are they missing, like, and then let's just hear the patient stories about like their experience with therapy, right? And I think if we had gone in, saying like, hey, patients, tell us what works, they would have thought about the little mechanical things that work for them. When we approached it with a more general uh vibe, they were like, I hate it. And you're like, okay, let's talk about that, right? Like, it makes me sad. It makes me feel like a failure. And it's like, like, and people were really emotional and vulnerable about it. And we would hear the same things over and over again. And those became part of our word cloud knowledge base of how we were approaching this. And then we would we would start to pick out those most important things and we would talk about it. And then we would try out a version of it when we were introducing the product to a doctor, like early prototypes, right? We prototyped with some friendly therapists and we would talk to them about here's what we're doing, here's why we made this thing, we are trying to keep them emotionally engaged and we want them to feel empowered, and they're like, yeah, these things are working. So in that way, we just kind of iterated on that a bit with the therapists without formalizing it. And then when the team started to ramp up and we needed to communicate it more internally and we needed to communicate it to the stakeholders who were paying the bills, that's when that sentence really coalesced, right? So post research, pre, during prototyping, before what you would consider production in games when you're building stuff. Because you really like, I mean, I think if you think about it as like a big wedge of cheese, right? The more you build, the more expensive every decision gets, right? And the more divergent stuff becomes. So, can you do it here? Because that'll be 10 times better than if you do it here. It's still good to do it here because that'll be 10 times better than when you do it over here, right? So, as early as possible. And that's probably the best answer I can give you. What if you're doing it solo? That's a spectacular question as well. Um, Harder to answer. I haven't actually done this ever by myself. Um, but I also wouldn't encourage you to do it by yourself. Even still, what I would encourage you to do is find a good friend who you can talk about this with, or try out a sentence with them. Spend a little bit of time and then argue with them about it. What maybe it's a early customer, maybe it's someone who who is invested and involved in the same kinds of things. But the reason is that you are never going to hear your own language and understand how someone else receives it, right? So even if it's just a rubber duck, an actual human rubber duck, right? Like, you want to bounce those words off of people and hear them reflected back at you. And if the meanings are coming back, like, one of the things that I found is really, really good, and this sounds super simple, which is great. Um, if you tell someone what your pitch is for the thing that you're working on, and then you say, tell me what I just told you, don't use any of my words, right? Use only your words. Like, you can't use any of the words in that sentence. Just tell me in your words, what did I tell you? And what you'll get back is something totally different. You'll be like, ah, fuck. And then you'll have to do it again and find out where that divergence was and how to communicate it in such a way. And then one day you will hear those words come back at you in a totally new format, but mean exactly the same thing. And that's when you got it right. So cool. Sheila, is it Sheila?
Yes, it's Sheila. Thank
Cool.
you. Thank you, Seppo. I really enjoyed your presentation, and
Oh,
it's
great.
got me thinking a lot. And similar to Victoria, I'm also solo, but I'm going to find a friend and do the one sentence and also have them recite back the words, and hopefully I get the vision right. But my question had to do around kind of the North Star question.
Mhm.
And my question is, how do you balance different audiences that your startup may target that have very weighty implications for your sentence?
Mm.
So what I mean by that is like taking your healthcare example. Um, so you could potentially target, you were targeting patients, but also healthcare providers you mentioned. And how did you balance those different audiences? Because that has implications for your sentence. And I guess for me, I'm in the education ed tech realm,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to balance whether to target students or teachers, and each of those has very different implications for my sentence. And I'm just curious how you guys hashed it out with the healthcare example, or if you have any advice for the North Star question.
Yeah, oh, that's a wild question. I like it. I how do you balance those? I hate to give you an answer. It's just like, well, it depends. Um, but the problem is it does, right? Like, I mean, I think that for me, one of the things that one of the challenges with this, right, is when you're trying to figure out who your audience is and you don't know, and there's not a clear answer, right? It's really easy to say it's both, right? Progress with either is great, right? Um, what do you want? Right? Like, because sometimes it may be that, like, look, your product is centered around the student experience, right? And so you'll have things in your concept that are anchored on the students, where the students are the core of your target audience. But, right? And I don't encourage you to add this as a clause in your sentence. It's better to find some other way to do it. But the money comes from these guys. They're a critical part of your audience. So, you know, maybe your sentence is a little longer. I don't think they're two separate things, though, because your product is not two separate things. So, you also, you know, what is most important to you? Because if I were to call out everything under the sun in my product, my sentence would be a paragraph. Well, I mean, it'd be an essay. I also am not good at editing, so it'd be a dictionary, right? But like that's where you make those priority calls. And can you tolerate a sentence about your product that doesn't have educators? Can you tolerate a sentence about your product that doesn't have anything about students in it? I don't know. But boy, that's a tough question. And if you can answer that early, you'll have made a ton of progress. So I hate to say it because it's like there isn't a clear answer. But the point is going through this exercise will force you to confront some questions about whether it's tolerable for you to make a product that has this as the priority or this is the priority or this, right?
Yeah.
And, for instance, you like, look, my product is focused entirely on the students. I don't give a shit about the educators, but I'm going to go broke. You can't do it, right? So for me, the benefit of this process is confronting those questions. I don't have an answer for you. And it's going to depend. Like I think one of the things that was really pleasurable about the projects that I've worked on is they aren't multi-sided, right? Even though therapists and patients and healthcare systems all seem like they have different motivations, our sole goal was efficacy for the patient because we knew that that would cascade into everything else, right? If we can make the patient experience better, they come back from more than 5 days of therapy. The therapists get to bill for that time. That means the healthcare providers love them. All of those things are aligned. So, I mean, maybe one question is what is the thread that aligns all those things? And if you can focus on that, then you get a simple sentence out of something that is multi-sided. But unfortunately, I can't say, yeah, this is how we balance that. That's going to really depend on your product and your intention as a creator. Um,
Thank you.
cool.
I don't have the raise hand. I don't know.
All right, let's see. I see your question here in the queue. Let me read it one sec.
Oh no, I just said I have a question.
Oh,
So,
okay.
what if you make your sentence and then you start making a prototype and then you realize it's not that strong, like it's not that good? Should you start over or are there steps to pivoting and what are those steps?
I mean, it depends on what you encounter. Again, I hate that the answer is sort of it depends, but you know, it really is dependent on the what you're seeing, right? Like, I don't think you go out there with um, you know, you think about a product, you put together a prototype, you try it. I don't I'm trying to think if I can think of a situation where the answer is, well, it's just bad, and you know, we do the whole thing again. You know, I think one of the reasons that when prototyping, when doing that MVP process, you really want to focus on something that is you can make clear predictions about. It's to avoid that, right? So that bad isn't bad, it didn't do this thing. I thought it would do this thing, and it didn't do the thing. So pivoting at that point is how do I either get it to do that thing and answer that question, or do I have a different question to ask? Right? I would not at the first sign of, you know, a prototype failure abandon the entire concept, right? Because usually at the point where I've bothered to make something, I've thought about it a bunch and I have some level of experience. So I hope that if you approach it with some level of experience, you are directionally headed in a sensible direction. Then you ask a specific question of your prototype and you don't get the answer. Sometimes it's worth looking at the prototype and saying, did I actually ask that question correctly? Right? Does my prototype, is my prototype, like, is often, sorry, too many thoughts, not enough words. Sometimes if you're building an MVP, you make calls about how to minimumness it, how to minimize what you're building, right? And usually, uh, it can be difficult to make that call correctly, right? That I made the absolute minimum I think I can, and it still answered that. It still asks the question I need it to ask. And an example might be, you know, you're building a game prototype. You build all these white box levels that are just not graphically nice. You have a character that is poorly animated. You have effects that are default effects from
Probably because I'm an artist and I just wanted things to look good and kept I like
yeah, don't do that.
rendered everything
But
around.
the point being that like sometimes you'll build something that's so minimal that you put it in front of your audience and they just can't see it. They can't see the thing that you're asking. They're like, this game looks like shit. I'd never play a game that looks this bad. And you're like, okay, I've asked you the wrong question, right? Someone can ask me that question. I'm used to seeing shitty prototypes that look awful, right? I think every game developer here is, but like, but if you ask a random person whose last game was like Final Fantasy VII remake and you show them a stick figure running through a white environment, they're going to be like, what is this shit? I'd never buy this. That's the wrong question,
Yeah.
right? And as an artist, I would also suggest, unless your question is about how good does this look, you're adding too much art, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're an artist and you're confident in your artistic ability, there's some stylistic questions you might answer, but quality is probably not going to be one of the major ones. If you've built games before and you've made stuff, the question you should be asking is, how does this resonate in a very specific way with an audience, right? I don't know. This is silly, but like you're like, look, my game is supposed to evoke a feeling of despair, right? It can look good, it can look bad. Does it evoke a feeling of despair? That's a better question because you can ask a user something very specific about the emotional state they're feeling. Do you feel bad? Yeah, okay. Do you feel sad? Yeah. Do you feel despair? No. Okay. Not the right thing. So I think it's not good, bad pivot. It's if you've written your sentence correctly, you're asking very specific things. And the first pivot is looking at the experience and saying, did I did I do a sufficient job of asking the right question? Right? And by that I mean, did my prototype, was it appropriate in scale, scope, complexity to have the experience that I wanted to convey and then have them respond to it in the right way? If the answer to that is yes, and it doesn't do what you want, that's when you have to reconsider what you're trying to do.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. D.
I actually have an anecdote that
Yeah.
is related to that. I recently joined a startup working on their first game, though it's a lot of people who are, it's a mix of like some newer folks and some folks who are very, very experienced. And they've been working together for about 2 years. I've been here for about a month. And they've gone through like 3 or 4 like pretty big pivots from what I've gathered, because I'm kind of in the process of doing like a 360 to see like, what's working, what's not, what are the problems, what are the opportunities. And one of the things that, has happened with them in the past couple of months is that they've turned the corner from like prototypes that were too similar to other things on the market and didn't really stand out. And then the team didn't really feel the vision, and like trying like, well, what if we made some like floating islands, and like made the landscape more, fantasy. And then they really liked that. And then it kind of like turned into this pivot over time to where airships became the thing. And so coming in, and like the rest of all of the team is going through this like process where for them, the vision has changed and they don't necessarily feel like they entirely know what it is. And coming in fresh and basically doing this kind of a like, can I condense this into one sentence to explain the vision? And if I can't, then we're not quite clear enough yet, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and distilling it down, like already has made a bunch of them go, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I get that. So
Yeah.
like, and it's not even fully formed yet. It's still a little bit too loose for what I would like, but it's kind of Clockwork Airship cracked them up Odyssey to restore the Greek underworld.
Okay.
And it's, that kind of a like, okay, you can kind of picture it in your head. Not exactly, but you're like, am I interested in that or not?
Mm-hmm.
And it's at least distinct enough that you're like, okay, I know the things that it's not.
Yep.
I haven't seen a lot of things that are exactly like that, and I'm intrigued.
Yep.
Okay, like,
Well, one thing that I
tell
would,
me more.
yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely a good start. I think that one thing that I would suggest as a metric for judging whether your sentence is useful, right? So craft them up, Greek Odyssey, restore the Greek underworld, airship,
Yep,
clockwork stuff. Um, what does your sentence cut away, right? Like,
yep,
you know, I think one of the things that was the most effective about the whole thing with Turrican was when people were like, "Oh yeah, this is not a cover shooter," right?
right.
And so when I hear your description, I'm like, okay, sounds Hades, sounds kind of JRP, potentially JRPG, could be a Western RPG, crafting, survival, islands, airships, clockwork. That can be a lot of things for
Yep,
me. Um, it does cut out a lot, right? Like, I have an image in my head of what this might be. But one thing that might be interesting, and I mean, just based on that thought of, I have an image in my head of what this might be. It might be interesting to say, okay, look, if I take this collection of words and write a sentence out of it, doodle me the game.
yeah, and it's already started cutting some things out, which is
Yeah.
good because there were things that through the process of 3 or 4 iterations of what is this thing we're making, that became vestigial and were just still attached because someone wrote them at some point and people were like, well, are we still doing this? And
Yeah.
I put this sentence in front of them, like even half formed, and they're like, oh yeah, no, I don't think we need that, do we?
Yeah. But that's a great exercise. Like, can you cut away all of it? Right? Can you come up with a
Yep,
sentence where it is so clear that, hey, now go back, look at the wiki, look at all the work that you've done, cut everything
Yeah.
that doesn't work with this and see what the result is, right? Because like what I bet happens is someone goes, okay, crafting, airship, clockwork. Hey, we have this element in crafting that is too modern. We're gonna cut it, and someone else goes, no, and those bits of disagreement are where things aren't clear enough. But I think, yeah, that sounds like a good start. And then, but it sounds like a good start, but it also sounds like a start. Like it sounds
Yeah.
like there's a couple more iterations of more focus, more specificity.
Yeah.
Um, and then when you can get everybody to essentially, doodle the game and it all comes out the same, that's when you're on the right page, right? Um, so yeah, but good. I'm glad that process is making progress. And like, I think, if you're coming onto a product that has done those iterations, this is a really good time for that because what's happened, I'm sure, is that, you got, let's say, 10 people on that team. At every iteration, someone liked something that is kind of still in the game. And
Yeah.
it's in limbo. It's not in it and it's not out of it, right? But it's in it in their mind, right? So they think of clockwork crafting, save the Greek underworld, and flying fish. And someone else is like, flying fish, fuck that. That was 3 iterations ago. Nobody gave a shit about that. Right? But it's still in their head. And you need to get it out of their head. So
Yeah.
you need to get it out of their head by having them articulate that's a critical part of the game for them, and then you need to chop it off or integrate it. Whatever. But
Yeah.
kill it. Yeah, but cool. Thank you. Dave? Oh, you're muted. Had to happen to someone.
You'd think after like 4 years of this stuff, I would stop doing. Yeah, Dee said something that kind of tweaked with me. Um, or actually, no, I think it was someone before that. How do you how do you balance that sentence so that you give the person enough information that they want to know more, but don't oversimplify to the point where it becomes reductive?
They
I know
ask
that's
for
a pretty.
more.
Yeah, like you,
Um,
you want them to, like, the whole idea is right, like the 30 seconds get you 5 minutes, get you,
yeah,
that whole thing. So like this sentence I think is a fantastic idea, but I'm just wondering how do you distill it so that you know, like you said, it's got to sound different than your competitors, but it also has to be something that resonates with people that they can recognize.
yeah,
Because if you come out completely out of left field, they're going to go, "What the hell?" But
right,
if you phrase it in a way that, well, that sounds exactly like this game.
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that, the one sentence is a starting point, right? It is for you, think of it as Occam's razor, right? Like you use it to cut away all the things that you don't want. You use it to focus building on the things that you do want. If you, a game is a complicated thing, right? If I told you, hey, Turrican is a hyper agile gun and run with creative firepower, you're not sold on that game, I imagine, right? If I start showing you concept art and you're like, whoa, this looks different. What is happening there? Right? What does creative firepower mean to you? And as we start fleshing out those details, they'll mean stuff, right? Those things will then show up in the art, they'll show up in the pitch in unique ways. And that's the hook, right? Like, so I think if you think of the sentence as the tool to focus, right? Then the pitch is the pitch, right? But you're using that sentence to focus the pitch. And so everything else that you need about a pitch, you need, something to hook the business folks, something to pitch to the gamers, something, that new hook that's something weird that you've never seen before, some emotional resonance, yada, yada, yada. How do those all tie in? Right? Like hyper agile gun and run with creative firepower is not an emotional journey, right? But the thing that was interesting was we quickly came up with a narrative and that came from the fact that like Corey Strader, the guy who drew that image of the main character, put a FedEx box on his back.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that.
And we were like, Of course, he's a delivery guy. And he's a delivery guy in the midst of this alien invasion and yada yada yada, right? Like life was not complicated here. Um, but that was not something that somebody was like, make him a delivery guy. It was, who is this character that lives in a hyper agile gun and run with creative firepower? Well, he's hyper agile. Let's make him someone who has to get from place to place. Is he a bike messenger? He's kind of like a bike messenger, but we don't have bikes here, right?
Right.
So those things just kind of all flowed out of that. And then, right, like make the best pitch you can using your experience at pitching stuff. Just think of the sentence as the tool that brings it all together. It keeps it from spiraling out of control. It means that, if somebody's like, hey, I wrote this like 400-page narrative doc for the deep lore of our first person shooter about blowing up weasels, like, weasels do not demand 400 pages of lore, right? Like, so it's just focus.
Awesome. Thanks.
Cool. I mean, we have gone wildly over time. I'm really glad y'all are sticking around. Hopefully it's been useful to you. Any other questions? So otherwise, I'm happy to wrap it up. But if I'm not connected to you on LinkedIn, please hit me up. I would love to stay connected. If this is useful to you in any way in the future, tell me stories. I love stories. Um, you know, but otherwise, it's been a pleasure meeting y'all and hanging out, and I hope it was useful. So,
Yeah, check your email. I fired you off a thing about a potential gig for you. So
oh, fantastic.
yeah.
Cool. Well, otherwise, take it easy. Have a great evening or morning or wherever you are. It's evening for me. And see you in the future.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Cool. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
Bye, everybody.
Here.
Bye.